Welcome to Commons Conversations, a summer series of interviews with campaigners sharing their experiences and insights into activism, learning in movements, radical history, and more. The program is broadcast by Community Radio 3CR and produced by the Commons Social Change Library, a website containing over 1,400 resources for campaigners, which can be accessed for free at commonslibrary.org. In today's episode, Holly Hammond from the Commons Library chats with Allison Rich and Dr Alicia Pawluczuk about their creative activism with the Endo Violence Collective. Endometriosis is a disease in which tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside the uterus. This can lead to inflammation, lesions, scar tissue, and adhesions between body organs. It is an incurable chronic disease associated with severe, life-impacting pain. It is estimated that 10% of women and people assigned female at birth live with endometriosis. Endo violence is a term developed by Dr Alicia Pawluczuk and expanded in collaboration with many others. Endo violence refers to the systemic and structural injustices resulting in health, social, economic, and digital inequalities. It encompasses a wide range of harmful practices, attitudes and behaviours that violate the rights and dignity of individuals seeking support and services. Endo violence is deeply connected to racism, classism, colonialism and ableism.
Hello and welcome to Commons Conversations. I'm meeting now with Allison and Alicia from the Endo Violence Collective. And I wanted just to start with if you're able to introduce yourselves and what your connection is to the collective.
Hi, I'm Allison Rich, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm the co-founder of the Endo Violence Collective, and I'm also an artist and an organizer based really from the environmental justice world. Also an artist who made a film about endometriosis called Not Normal.
Thanks, Allison. And you are joining us from the United States?
Yes, it's a pleasure to join you here today from Miami, Florida, USA.
Great.
Hi, I'm Alicia. My artist name is Hystera. So I go by Dr. Alicia Pawluczuk in my research and then Hystera in the context of my art. The story of Endo Violence, it kind of started a few years ago when I set up an exhibition in Berlin, Germany, and when I sort of realized after years of living with endometriosis and also dealing with all the systemic injustice within the endometriosis community, I realized that the system is quite violent. And so I came up with this idea of endo violence, and I invited community to co-create its meaning. And so as I went along, there was different steps, that I went through, and one of which was setting up a little magazine around endo violence. And that's how I came across incredible work of Allison, the film, and that's how we got connected. And Allison was featured as one of the artists in the second edition of the Endo Violence magazine. She had this incredible energy, and she really was this visionary person that comes in and say, hey, look, we can make things happen despite our limitations and, disabilities. And that's how we set up the collective.
I'm curious about the framing of violence. Have you found that's really resonated with people who are living with endo when they kind of hear the concept of endo violence?
In the context of the early work, I think it was the endo violence as a concept was kind of co-created by the community. So I based my initial understanding on whatever the community provided me with, and that was the digital endometriosis community. So I did like a thing online, and then that's how I gathered the first kind of concepts around that and the first lived experiences. And it really made sense to many people that it is a systemic issue and that is rooted in, centuries of misogyny and sexism and exclusion, racism, and how it is a form of violence. Yeah, it is excluding you. It is making you invisible. And so I have lots of stories about people resonating with the concept, although not without criticism, because I had one person actually telling me that maybe as a non-English speaker, as a Polish person, maybe I don't fully understand what violence means, because in this context, that might not be the case. Needless to say, that person didn't have endometriosis. So it's just interesting. And I am aware that it's a very strong word. But I think Allison has, like, she came to it when the first idea of endoviolence was out there. So I think she is the person who can say about how it actually resonated with her and how she built it forward.
I was so excited to discover the work that Alicia was doing with University of Leeds and on her own also to give a word to what we often consider to be an invisible disease, because I feel as if endoviolence does in its own right give visibility to the many forms of the way that living with endometriosis and navigating ableism in the world can affect us. And so I think what endoviolence does really well as a term and as an idea and as an ideology for how we can movement build across a lot of silos and disciplines that may not interact often enough is it helps us to understand the ways that endometriosis is not just a physical disease. It's not just lesions that may grow throughout the body that we yet to really understand what our lesions are made out of, but also the ways that we may encounter microaggressions, whether it be in the workplace, not having the accommodations we need to succeed, or in our own families, facing violence in terms of not being believed, or just speaking to the delays in diagnosis. I think endoviolence really speaks to the emotional, political, cultural, and social aspects of navigating the world with what I view almost as a double consciousness of living with endometriosis.
That is so great to hear in terms of, how individualized health can be. You're an individual with this condition and this is your individual experience and your individual problem. When we go to a framing of endoviolence, we can see, the shared struggle that's there and the fact that these are like societal forces at play. Alicia, was there something you wanted to add in?
Yeah, I was just thinking that hopefully by the time this podcast is out, the publication, the book that I have been working with, but also people from the collective have contributed to, will provide like a more coherent definition of what endoviolence might mean. And within the research that I've been doing, it really is about the multi-layered and very complex and networked injustice around endometriosis. Because one of the things that I've noticed is that very often we do look at endometriosis in isolation. And so perhaps there is, the medical aspect and there's this and that, but there's so many different layers out there, right? And it's more about how you navigate the world with the awareness that you might have endometriosis and you might not have access to basic gynecological care. That means you might be disbelieved by other people. It's like the structure of all the different things that you need to navigate. And I feel like by giving it a name and within the framework or whatever we want to call it, endoviolence, there will be, I identify different types of violence, right? So there is the epistemic violence, for instance, erasure of knowledge, certain types of knowledge. Why is lived experience not adequate as a form of knowledge? Why is there a research gap? Why is there a gender health gap in general? So it's whose voices are being heard. And so there's different forms of violences that will be there. I still can't decide whether it's a framework or a thing, because I am within academia, but I also want to make sure that this is something kind of tangible and something that we can share, while acknowledging that there is so many limitations, right? Like you cannot create something that will cover all of the injustice that is out there.
And before we head too much more into the conversation, I think it's really important that we notate with endoviolence that something I think it does really well is also include the ways in which systematic and structural violence affects communities disproportionately. So Alicia and I are both people that present as female and as white. And I just want to name that as a privilege that we have, and also acknowledge that there are many communities that experience structural violence that do experience endoviolence differently based solely on the nature of violence. And so let's just name that there are also people who are maybe assigned female at birth or may not identify as women who also suffer from endometriosis, and also the delays in diagnosis that may be exacerbated by class and also by race.
I thought for our readers, I'll just quote a little bit of your site. Endo violence refers to the systemic and structural injustices resulting in health, social, economic, and digital inequalities. It encompasses a wide range of harmful practices, attitudes, and behaviours that violate the rights and dignity of individuals who are seeking support and services. And so this concept has been a great way for people to connect and kind of share their experiences. I found it really moving to read in the magazine different people talking about their experiences of living with endometriosis and coming up against this violence. Just really also want to acknowledge how creativity has been really central to your project. So related to that, Allison, what drew you to create the film that you did, Not Normal?
So I started creating Not Normal for a few different reasons. One was that I myself, for 18 years, was told that my painful periods were normal, essentially told that the symptoms I was having were in my head due to stress. And I myself was also misdiagnosed with Crohn's disease when I actually had deep infiltrating endometriosis of the colon. And it took me probably about 10 doctors misdiagnosing me before a pelvic physical therapist named Justine actually told me about endometriosis. And from there, it was a rapid education into endometriosis care and how to navigate really complex medical systems, especially living in a state like Florida, where I think it's international news at this point that period literacy is under attack, that period education is under attack in our school systems here, as well as all healthcare related to people assigned female at birth or gendered medicine. And so after traveling across the country to find a surgeon who could operate on more advanced and deep infiltrating endometriosis, extrapelvic endometriosis, I needed to really digest and process the experience of not being believed, of facing violence across all aspects of my life, from my own family to my career, to the doctors that told me it was all in my head. I also am really into DIY art, do-it-yourself art. And I had a very limited budget. And so I just started playing with how I could use Canva and my iPhone to start to create a way to create a timeline to my own story. And along the way, I really thought it was essential to share the information that I had found about endometriosis, because I could not believe how difficult it was to just find somewhat accurate information. And to be able to put that together into a 20-minute film, I was really excited about the opportunity to create a free resource that people could watch wherever they were, to feel less isolated in our own communities, and something that we could share with people to say, I might not be the only one who experienced this. And at the time, there were also other films about endometriosis that did cost money to view. And I just felt that we needed more openly accessible resources. And as an ecofeminist, I really wanted to create biodiversity in terms of the narratives that were being used to tell our stories. I really believe that we need diverse creative mediums to bring visibility to this disease, and also to make sure that folks know that it's not linear, that healing is not linear, and that just as the disease is so individual, that there's going to be really individual stories and experiences in navigating the disease. And it was actually not well received in the US. I really encountered a lot of gatekeepers in the digital space that were unwilling to share the film. And so when Alicia found the film and invited me to share it through the second edition of the magazine, it felt like kismet, for lack of a better word. It really felt serendipitous to find Alicia and to find this larger community of artists that she had curated and that she had found throughout the world that were creating creative work to bring visibility to each of our experiences. And also, I think we were all just inspired to curate the magazine because of Alicia's amazing work to create her artwork as well that brings visibility to endometriosis.
What do you think the particular challenges are around what gets called invisible disability or invisible illness why is it so important to kind of shine a light and create more visibility, given many people's experience of their illness not being seen or acknowledged or recognized?
I think something that people with endometriosis or diseases that are considered invisible often encounter is, but you don't look sick, but you look fine. How can you ask for an accommodation? It really is microaggression on every single aspect of society and our ability to navigate achieving livable qualities of life. I think the invisibility that is not invisible at all. I think that the disease is actually quite visible in our society. I think it's visible when we find surgeons or medical teams that understand the disease. I believe that the work of the Endo Violence Collective, and the reason why it's so important that it is an international collective, is to use digital spaces or non-traditional cultural spaces to lift the conversation of endometriosis outside of these digital communities where so often we may connect into larger cultural institutions that really allow for folks to understand that A, the disease exists, and that B, that it's really individualized, and C, that people with endometriosis deserve to have support and to be seen and to be heard.
I was just thinking about this idea of invisibility and visibility, and how, yes, in recent years, we have become hyper visible within social media, which is absolutely amazing, and lots of incredible things have happened. But this visibility is also, there's a power behind it. Who gets to be seen and on whose terms? What is the algorithm going to show us, right? So even when Allison mentioned this story of, trying to get into the mainstream with her film, which wasn't ticking certain boxes, and how perhaps that would not be considered as a right way to raise awareness, or perhaps, and also finding that space where something is visible in a meaningful way, right? What is important, I guess, to understand with this visibility is that hyper visibility or visibility doesn't mean inclusion, because we are very much aware of all these different tactics that are out there to, do this performative inclusion and all of those things. And so I really feel that there's more to that than just making it visible. And I guess one of the things that I often struggle with is, how many more stories of or disbelief or struggle or pain do we need to share before someone's going to take it seriously? And that type of visibility, some of the things that I've seen around, there was an article that I wrote 2 years ago about the Sun British newspaper accusing girls of causing moral panic online because they share their bodies in a way they want to, which means, they share pictures of them being sick, and apparently they're begging for likes. So to me, that invisibility, and I'm talking about it in relation to endometriosis as an invisible condition. I see it as a form of silencing that has been there for many centuries, right? So with the myth of hysteria, and many people have written about it as well, and we are experiencing it as well. So my worry sometimes is that visibility on its own might not lead to systemic change.
Yeah, really relatable. A saying was coming to mind: it's only invisible if you don't know what to look for. For many of us, it's very visible to us. But I'm also kind of conscious of myself, and move between these different states of well and unwell, being able to be perceived as able-bodied, but also, at other times just not being able to be visible because I'm bedridden and no one is seeing me in that moment. But also how I can pass as well. So I'm thinking about right now, I'm sitting here with you. I've got my TENS machine on that's sending electrical pulses to interrupt my pain signals to my brain. I've already taken 2 kinds of medication. I'm going to take more medication after I get off this call, because I didn't want to take it before the meeting because it can cause nausea. over the course of the day, I'll be taking several other kinds of drugs. After this call, I'll lie down for a while to give my body a rest. All of that management is going on at the time. It's a lot of work to be able to continue to be productive and doing our work and maintaining our relationships and connections in the world.
Just to expand on that, like I'm also sitting here with a lot of adaptive equipment, whether it's my seat and having space as someone who has rectovaginal endometriosis. But when we talk about productivity, so often the expectation is that not just people with endometriosis, but anyone with a dynamic disability is asked essentially to mask their symptoms to appear productive and to meet more of a capitalist standard of productivity, whereas the work that we do to maybe save our own lives is often not viewed as productive. Something that comes to mind is really basic, is just how many times maybe in a job you may be asked, well, even if you don't feel well enough to go to the meeting, can you just go with your camera off? And that in itself is a form of a microaggression. And to tie it back into visibility, we have to often ask ourselves whose stories are being told and how are those stories framing productivity? This idea that with health, you are sick, you receive an intervention and you get better. And by getting better, you go back to normal. And normal should be being productive in the way that you're able to achieve being able to work and make money for adults, or for young people being able to go to school and meet the same exact standards. And so I hope something that we are starting to explore with Endo Violence Collective and the many artists and writers and creative work and health experts that we're connecting to is how do we diversify and create diversity within the ways that we view and tell stories about endometriosis.
When we talk about endoviolence, I think it's important to recognize the endoviolence within ourselves. And this is something that I tried to do while I was writing the text, is the amount of expectations that I have from myself, the amount of violence that I put myself through, even as a part of the community. Am I representing everybody? As an Eastern European migrant, should I be, sharing stories that are perhaps representing all the other regions, So it's not just within the endoviolence in terms of my internalized ableism and productivity regimes, because these have ruled my life and they still do. But then again, I'm also learning that I am neurodivergent. So the way I see work and passion is slightly different, right? I operate in a different time zone altogether, because sometimes doing things actually helps me to feel better. But I also call myself out very often thinking, oh, you are like perpetuating capitalism. But no, actually, neurodivergent rest is different. And perhaps it is about also accepting these different ways of being, which I know you need to be in a position of privilege in the first place to be able to do that, right? Because you need to have enough money to pay for your bills, you need to be able to have food, all of those things are like crucial. And here I am, I can talk about endoviolence, but the thing is that I have these mostly basic needs met. So I think there is that part as well. So but one thing that I would like to emphasize here is that internalized endoviolence, right? And the way it manifests in your everyday life, and how we have adopted these violent structures and as a way of survival, in a sense, because we need to reenact certain standards in a certain way. You have to be cute and nice, but not too intelligent. When you go to the doctor, you gotta look good, but not too good. And all of these things, the performative nature of that. So maybe it's just picking little battles with our internalized endoviolence and see what we can do step by step.
Yeah, I'm really interested how the Endo Violence Collective, how the fact that your crew are living with chronic illness and, capacity may go up and down. Are there ways that you found to work together that allows for that and, supports people to be in different levels of contribution at different times?
Well, first of all, just to speak to what Alicia just mentioned with internalized endoviolence, there's so much work to be done to unlearn that violence and to stop gaslighting ourselves. So I just want to say that if you've ever asked yourself, am I just stressed? Is that why I'm feeling so bad? Did I just eat the wrong thing? Did I just not exercise enough? These are all little ways that we live through internalized endoviolence. And as part of that, I come from a nonprofit background. And in the US, the standard of nonprofits is that your passion equates to the amount that you're able to almost physically harm yourself. I know that might be a concept that resonates with a lot of folks, and it's not sustainable in the truest sense of the word. I, prior to getting sick, often operated in a way of just simply disassociating from my body and from any type of feeling, to the point of urinating on myself because I couldn't feel my bladder, to the point of, passing out in supply closets because I wasn't aware of how much I was pushing myself past capacity. And so one of the things that excited me most when I jumped into starting to just edit Alicia's work with Endo Violence #2 was the essay that she created around the concept of crypt time. I think crypt time is a really important concept that we try our best to experiment with within the Endo Violence Collective. So I think as people assigned female at birth, we're often taught to apologize simply for existing. And there's a lot of unlearning that we're exploring in terms of, do we need to apologize when we have a delay in an email, or can we assume that we're living with a dynamic disability that has high highs and low lows, and there really is nothing to apologize for? We write in Endo Violence magazine, this is a quote: "To situate myself and the Endo Violence magazine outside of these narratives, I'd like to use crypt time as a critical lens. As defined by Critical Disability Studies Collective, crypt time is a concept arising from disabled experience that addresses the ways that disabled/chronically ill and neurodivergent people experience time and space differently than able-body-minded folk."
It's how do we ensure that we don't operate on like this violent cycle, or that we don't perpetuate violence, And so crypt time to me is actually like a way to allow ourselves to ease into the way we live our lives, and not necessarily see it as a linear progression from this to that, and as a success story or recovery story, but more as a dynamic, functioning in the world that is actually mostly the case for lots of people, right? It's tricky, setting up a collective of people who have disabilities but are extremely passionate and prone to overwork themselves. It's like, to me, it feels like there is a constant need for care, but also reminding ourselves that we have limitations and that we should take these seriously. And so I think, it's been a year now that we are doing this, more or less. And I think we had to make some decisions as we go through to create some boundaries, and also to understand how to work in a way so we don't self-exploit. And this is a very difficult, balance to find, because it's free labor. It's often, there's lots of emotional labor involved. We had examples, and so I where people were reaching out and perhaps sharing their trauma, which is very often the case within the endometriosis community. But we also have to realize that we are not maybe the right people to deal with that. So I guess it is more at this stage understanding about what the collective shouldn't be doing, because there's so many things that are possible, but we really have limited time and energy. And so I think we've been trying to be kind to each other and to ourselves, but there have been moments where obviously we were overwhelmed. And I think more recently, we've decided to take a break from social media for some time. And Allison is the person who has been kind of building this community on social media throughout the last year. And I cannot imagine the amount of work, free labor in a sense, when we think about the capitalist term, which we have to, because we are human beings living in a world where we have to purchase food. So the amount of hours that she's put in it's a lot. And I think the idea of a collective itself is also something that we are exploring, trying to learn how to navigate it in an ethical way, and actually getting things done as well.
You're listening to Commons Conversations on Community Radio 3CR. Today we're hosting a conversation between Holly Hammond from the Commons Library and Allison Rich and Dr Alicia Pawluczuk about the work of the Endo Violence Collective.
Yeah, just thinking about, how engaging in collective action is really empowering and important for people, but that there is barriers to being engaged in that. So for myself, I've really been noticing how contingency plans are really important for me, because when I'm in pain, it's very hard for me to look into the future and think I'll be well enough to do something. So, on a social front, it might be, okay, we can buy the tickets, and then if I'm not well, we'll give the ticket to this friend. Or we've got this deadline for this work project. The backup plan is that someone else in the team will do the meeting if I'm not well. I'll start CCing people into my correspondence in case they have to pick it up when I need to, take the time out. And so thinking about people engaged in lots of different struggles for social change, climate or social justice, different kinds of work that people are doing. Often it is really fast-paced, reactive. This is the way that you can be involved. Right now, we just need everybody to go and knock on doors, or this is the tactic that we're doing right now that we need people to do. Being able to provide a bit more of a menu for people, that there are different kinds of contributions they can make that fit with their capacity, or rather than putting all the emphasis on something synchronous, like we all need to be at this place at this time, how can people engage in something in an asynchronous way so when they have the capacity they can input, but it's not all focused on that one time when everyone has to show up.
I think that's an excellent point. And just to bring it back to the larger Endo Violence Collective, I think if we achieve nothing else, the goal is ultimately to hold space for this diversity of stories. What I've been most amazed by is the amount of folks from authors, from filmmakers, from artists, from activists, just people surviving, living with endometriosis. We're finding throughout the world that are telling stories about the accommodations that we may need to feel like we have a place in society. And I think with some of the contingency plans that you discuss in your own work, that's something that we often are exploring within the Endo Violence Collective. So if one of us drops off, like if we go into a flare, or if, right now I am escaping literal endo violence where my housing was lost based on discrimination from a family member around endometriosis. How do we adapt? Because as much as we may want to be productive and put out another version of the magazine or have an art exhibition, our survival is key, and our humanity. And as part of that, a term that just comes to mind when we're talking about contingency plans that I've been exploring is this concept of endometriosis grief, or endo grief, as a response to endo violence that we experience.
Yeah, it's a really powerful concept. I'm just so conscious of there's so much loss with living with chronic illness, and oftentimes that's not visible to people as well, that we're dealing with this grief and anticipatory grief, like the things that are coming ahead that we might not be able to access or have. Just that we got into talking about activism there, and I did really want to draw you out on that. Do you see your work in the Endo Violence Collective as activism, and the work that you're doing, producing the magazine, or the early art exhibition that you did, or creating a film? All of these feel like they are activism?
I think before I started calling myself an artist, I would always call myself an artivist, because it was more of a term that I felt more comfortable with. And so maybe for the collective as well, I feel that it is a form of artivism, uniting people.
This is actually a conversation that we're having right now in the collective. Alicia comes from an academic, she is based in an academic world. And the origin of the work around endo violence, as much as it is part of her art, is also part of her academic work. And within academia, there is an aversion, for lack of a better word, to calling ourselves activists, right? Because we want to be seen as factual, as safe information. And that being said, I, as an organizer, believe that any type of endometriosis advocacy, any discussion about endometriosis that is positive in the context of correct information, not spreading misinformation, is in itself activism. And I do view the collective as using creative work as a form of activism. And the reason why I love this way of working is because I feel so often that activist movements are currently based in our geographies. So I live in the US. Alicia is based currently in the UK, but she's an international citizen. You are based, we're in a different day right now. I'm in Thursday and you're in Friday. And each of us within our countries have a lot of systems that we're working within, the medical standard systems, the advocacy organizations and what they're pushing for, and then the system of just navigating these systems as individuals. And what I love about endo violence, and what I hope we can do as activists, is connect beyond these silos within our countries, connect beyond this debate, what is the origin of the disease, connect beyond what is the proper treatment, connect beyond whose stories get told, who gets to be visible, what types of stories do we want to tell, and hopefully build a movement. Because I believe that in order to build a movement, we must recognize that gendered medicine is, of course, political. We're having this conversation while I'm in deep endo grief around the current election in the US, and I live in a state where the majority did want to ban abortion care, where the majority did want to vote for Donald Trump as our president, knowing that it's going to lead to increased policing and state determination of our ability to access health in a way that ultimately will perpetuate vast gendered violence. So I think that endometriosis needs more spaces for activism. And what concerns me the most is so often the people leading these activist movements are doctors, medical doctors. And as much as medical doctors are absolutely our allies, they may not have the skills or capacity or lived experiences to be the sole voices leading the movement building for endometriosis activism, to demand that we deserve a livable quality of life. And doctors themselves are working within systems that make it really hard for them to often be activists, or to determine what they think may be best for supporting people with endometriosis.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you also might read in a book one day is this idea that endoviolence is supposed to be used as this critical lens, but its foundations are grounded in, like transformative justice. So it isn't about creating more divisions, because I feel that there's going to be more divisions. There are divisions. There is the influencers culture, which fair enough, it is what it is, and it's great, and people deserve to get paid for the work. But I think endoviolence in itself, I see it as a way to see those things, to recognize for what they are, to potentially make them visible, but actually working in a way that isn't, creating more divisions. But at the same time, I recognize there's a need for self-defense, right? So how do you self-defend yourself within that system? How do you organize without perpetuating more violence? And so that's just a concept. In reality, things might look very different.
Is it all right if I just give some really brief examples of endometriosis, endoviolence, and activism within the collective? So I'm just going to use first names to talk about folks that are involved in the collective, just to protect folks. One of our leaders within the collective is someone who I consider to be an activist named Angie. And Angie is a phenomenal writer. And she also, I believe, incorporates activism into the way that she practices mental health care. She's really creating a model for how people with endometriosis can need and deserve to have access to specialized mental health care, not because we are hysterical, but because of the violence that we experience in just existing with endometriosis. Another person that comes to mind that's connected to the collective is someone named Alex. She is also a researcher, and she put on an amazing conference called the Endometriosis Revolution. In that way, she really brought activism around endometriosis through creative practices into academia, and also made sure that it was a free event that was accessible to many people, and also thought about activism in terms of the way that she planned the conference and the accommodations that folks would need, whether it's a low inflammatory food at the event. And then we also have another collective member named Rachel, who really archives stories of endometriosis, not only activism and visibility, where each piece that she makes represents an individual story, but also curating those stories into exhibitions. I'm really grateful. I just got a copy of this book called Others Like Me from an amazing author named Nicole Louis, who I think is really doing an amazing job of activism through writing, where she's incorporating stories about endometriosis into larger experiences of living in a world where we choose to or may not choose to be mothers.
Hearing you talk about these different forms of activism and also the role of doctors and other people really struck that, social change requires an ecosystem where people are playing different roles. And on the Commons Library, one of our most popular resources is from Bill Moyer, who wrote about the 4 roles of activists and the 8 stages of social movements. And the 4 roles are citizen, reformer, rebel, and change agent. So, often we'll hear about the reformers. There are, in Australia, I think we've got a kind of a big body around endometriosis, and they're, doing the submissions and they're in the meetings with politicians, that kind of thing. But the rebel role is more of a disruptive thing, which is really standing up and saying, no, that's not acceptable, that's not okay. Kind of there to put the issue on the agenda really strongly for people. And the change agent is about building a big group of people. It's about organising and bringing people together to take action. But it's also about visioning and paradigm shift. So I think in liberation movements, it's so crucial to have an analysis of what the problem is and to hold out a picture of how things could be different. And I really think, your endo violence work's been powerful around that, really amplifying people's lived experience and showing the leadership of people with the lived experience of living with endometriosis, but also using creativity to put forward different ideas that kind of contribute to that change.
I love that. Thank you so much for framing the work that we're doing in that way. And what comes to mind also, and I don't have the exact term because I am experiencing a little bit of endo fatigue at the hour, is just the work around the spectrum of change and how we really work with the spectrum of the different roles within social change movements to create systematic changes. So there's this idea that on one end you have laggards and on the other end you have innovators. And then if you can just move every portion of folks in between these two spectrums just over one notch, that we put the laggards eventually into the minority, and we can slowly move folks that are innovators into the majority. And I really hope that this is work that we're doing with the Endo Violence Collective. So often the innovative work around endometriosis requires a certain level of expertise to understand, and it can be really isolating. And I think that the isolating to larger communities that may not have access to scientific literacy or educational literacy in the way that medical systems define it. And so I really hope that what we're doing is we are acting as innovators that are slowly using creative practices to bring visibility, to slowly turn laggards into the minority, and so that we can create a majority. Understand that endometriosis is not just a social justice issue for people that are living with it, for people who love people with endometriosis, for people who treat people living with endometriosis, but it really truly is a societal issue that affects not only our quality of lives, but the quality of lives across the spectrum of society. And that we aren't going to be able to build a movement where we shift the standard of care without having really strong alliances and coalitions across issue areas.
I just wanted to say that to me, hearing your words, Holly, about endoviolence and actually doing the analysis of endoviolence, it kind of feels surreal, and whenever we have these conversations, or whenever someone approaches us and say, oh yeah, I read Endo Violence, or it just blows my mind. I'm just, whenever, because it feels like you are doing something, perhaps you are connected to so many people, but you're also doing it a little bit in isolation. And with this type of work, I also realized that I spent most of my life in community education and non-formal education prior to joining academia. And I've always seen this huge divide between the real knowledge and the less, acknowledged experiences, or the knowledge from the communities. So to actually hear that the concept and the understanding, and as a collective, we are floating around in different spaces, it really means a lot. And ideally, yes, I really hope we are going to move forward in some way, and we will see how it goes, because I also see the whole thing as an experiment. Like within the crypt time, for instance, it doesn't have a specific goal or agenda or something that we need to achieve, or to feel successful. It's not about that. It really is a process, and it might be messy, unpredictable, very complex. And we might be very busy tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow we'll just rest. So I also see the richness in that way of working, and actually learning about ourselves as well while doing that. So I just wanted to say thank you for just taking the time to think about endoviolence, because this is incredible. This is the value of the work. This is essentially us having that conversation. That to me is like, wow, this is change, so thank you.
Just really conscious, so often we are doing things and we can't see clearly what the impact of that work is, or how it's affecting the people who are coming across it. So yeah, I'm really happy to be someone who's come across your work and can kind of reflect back to you. This makes a difference. Like, this is important.
Holly, just while we're having this conversation, I just want to say, first of all, you are now part of the Endo Violence Collective. The work that you are doing to bring visibility to it, thank you so much. We are not defining collective in the formal sense where there's a set group and we're the only collective members. It really is about movement building. And so I just want to take a moment and just shine the light back on you and say, first of all, thank you so much for having us here today. But also, I'd love to ask you what endo violence means to you.
I feel like I'm really in it at the moment, because this year I had some beautiful months without pain. Then my pain has come back since August, and I've been in that process of trying to get more information about what's going on, having the ultrasound, speaking to this specialist. This week I spoke to a pain specialist, and it was incredibly disempowering. And the things that you're saying around expertise, I feel like that's something I really have to keep reminding myself, that sometimes we're in these rooms with health professionals who know less about endometriosis than we do, and certainly they're not greater experts about our own individual experience. So trying to kind of put that strength behind me when I go into those spaces, and that is the value of the collective. That there are all these other people also going through these processes. Yeah, I think from this conversation, I'm thinking about the endo violence I've experienced from outside, in terms of stigma, medical neglect, the actual pain of living with endometriosis, and the pain of surgery and recovery from surgery. But I'm also really thinking about that internalized endo violence. And I think this is really making me think about, there's enough going on without me pouring more on myself. I think earlier on you were talking about capitalism and productivity. It's like, capitalism's hard enough to deal with, let alone having endometriosis in capitalism. The double combo, and the way that how we approach it and how we live our lives is all part of the change that we're trying to create. So I definitely feel like endometriosis has also taught me things, and I've grown from the experience of having it, in terms of connecting more to my body and the signals that my body sends me, trusting my own thinking, being an advocate for myself in different spaces. Is there anything else that you would like to say to finish off?
I'd love to just mention really quickly that another system that I'm often thinking about endo violence in is also within environmental justice movements. And I would just like to just take this space to say that these are movements that should be interconnected, that the way that we are treating the earth, the nature of climate change, the nature of environmental health exposures, which we know environmental health exposures actually can be a contributor to causing endometriosis, are all systems that we can collectively explore when we're thinking about larger change and a more livable future with less endo violence.
And that's going to hopefully be in the book with environmental violence and some evidence around how that has an impact on those, suffering from endometriosis as well. But yeah, you're right. All of these things are interconnected. And it's not to say that there's going to be a list of, these are the different types of violence. Let's just like create this very happy list. But it's recognizing these connections as well. And I'm sure there's going to be more and more and more. But this is just the beginning, I hope. Or maybe not. Maybe, yeah, it's about finding more connections, but it's about hopefully erasing some of these structural forms of injustice. Yeah.
Sure. And so the book.
So Alicia is an amazing researcher, and she's currently doing her research within University of Leeds. I believe she is a fellow within the Include network. And as part of that work, she really has been exploring so many different concepts around endo violence. And she recently hosted a residency where she brought artists from around the world together and really gave us an opportunity, or artists, to explore the different ways that digital equity and inclusion affect us in our daily lives and in our work and how we can respond to it. And I'm so grateful that after that, she took time to sit down and to really put into words so much of her learning around endo violence. So I'm really grateful that she allowed the collective to read the book, and she invited us to be contributors within it, which is not traditional within an academic structure. But what the book does so well is it literally gives word and meaning to so many of the different experiences that we have. And I think Alicia does an amazing job of incorporating her own experiences of living with endometriosis into why there is a need to research endo violence and to research it not only in digital spaces, but across these multiple intersecting areas.
Oh, thank you so much for describing it so well. So I can, yeah, it's like it's having a war. So yeah, but I guess the purpose of endo violence as a publication is to have a starting point where we get to organize our thinking and activism around it, and actually also create some solid theoretical structure to say, hey, there is evidence that there's different types of violence within this extremely violent system. And it really depends on where you are in the privilege kind of oppression system. It really is affected by the intersectional factors and where you are in the world. Looking at all these different aspects, I feel like it allows us to connect these things together. And also, like I said before, to create this lens or notion where we are recognizing that one's position in the world is affected by endo violence, which is interconnected system of oppression. And it's about maybe creating this understanding, and to begin with having some literature around it, while adding members of the collective into the discussion as well, and kind of adding my own voice to it as well. And in line with critical scholars, I'm trying to make this book sort of accessible and make sure that feelings, are also part of writing. So I wouldn't like this to be a cold publication that is like supposed to deliver a certain type of message, but I do want this to be something in between. So it's not going to be a typical academic publication, and I guess maybe that's the value of it as well, being something in between and being this a starting point. But yeah, I'm very privileged to have this collective authorship and having all these different people kind of jumping in and adding few things. It's a bit of an experiment of how to create something in a collective manner without exploiting people. And so this was something that my professor, Helen Thorne, that I work with, she says, why don't you just go and use the approach of data feminism, where you are actually inviting people to co-edit parts of it. And so I went into that direction, but it's probably not as amazing as data feminism because they took full accountability of their references and stuff. But yeah, that's the book. That's the book, and the book will be out soon, definitely by the end of this year.
Sounds great. And it's great to hear the creative way that you've approached it. Definitely at the Commons, we're really interested in kind of connecting academia with activism because they can be so siloed and apart. But even the way that you are writing this book and co-authoring this book, it's a great way to shake things up. Thank you so much, Alicia and Allison from the Endo Violence Collective. It's been really affirming and soul enriching to talk with you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for having us. We're so grateful to be here. And you can find more resources around the Endo Violence Collective at endoviolence.com or find our Instagram account at endo.violence.collective. We invite you to be part of this movement. You don't need to have endometriosis. You don't even need to know what it is, but we invite you to come and learn and organize with us. Thank you so much.